Hi everyone, my name is Usva Seregina, and this is my keynote titled The Future of Larp as a Commodity. And just a quick note, I do have a longer talk titled Living or Larping, Consumer Culture um, on these same topics. If you're interested, please attend that talk as well. So before we get to the gist of this talk, really, I want to address the main terminology that I'll be using and really what I mean by commodity. So stereotypically, we tend to understand commodity as something that's bought or sold, something that has monetary value. And I want to stress that the way I'm approaching commodity is not in the sense of that we're putting a price tag on LARP or that we're selling LARP to a wider audience. So I'm a consumer sociologist in my profession, so I research consumer culture, and so I'm approaching it as a cultural term, as something that changes how we form relationships, how we approach things. And so from this perspective, commodity is an object that's the focus of consumption, and consumption becomes an act of appropriating something to satisfy personal needs and desires. So something quite self-directed, something that's driven by desire, and so something that we want to have rather than do as an action. And so commodity becomes the focus of such a relationship. And obviously, if LARP becomes a commodity, that significantly changes how communities formed around it, how we approach it, how we approach LARP organizers, etc. And so that's really what I want to address today. So what has led to commodification of LARP? So LARP becoming a commodity. Now, just to note, this is not based on empirical research, but this is rather kind of an assessment of the context that I've made. And so the main things that I believe have led to commodification are the following. Firstly, I think there's a wider acknowledgement of LARP in society. So sort of it's become more known, it's become more understood as an activity. And because we live in a society that's largely driven by consumption and commodification, those structures are then also influencing LARP. So we're not as marginalized anymore. There's also a growing demand for LARP, so more and more people want to LARP, and that means we have to figure out ways to offer this to people. And one of the main ways that we know how to do that in our society is through making something a commodity. Thirdly, I think there's growing objectification of LARP, and this is sort of through a number of things. You know, we're documenting it more, we're selling things around it, and so it does start to take on structures of a commodity. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, I think there's a driving wish of us as a community to become legitimized in society, so sort of to be accepted as a hobby, as an activity, and as a community. And because the way things are legitimized in wider culture is through commodification, through something becoming an object of consumption, we are also feeling like we need to take on those structures in order to be accepted by wider society. So what are the pros of commodification? It's obviously nothing is purely evil. There's always good and bad sides. So the pros are, you know, we do get legitimized, we do get accepted by wider culture. More experiences can be kind of personalized, so directed at own needs and desires, things like that. There's more efficiency and easiness in the production of LARPs, the consumption of LARPs. There's also raised standards and expectations, so we get more kind of normatized, you know, safety techniques, for example. When people are organizing LARPs, there's, you know, more tools for them to use that have been developed by previous organizers. When we're attending LARP, we also have more tools to cope with bleed, for example, and with other things like that. There's also more accessibility, clearly. You know, people from various backgrounds, people with various needs, do gain more visibility and thus more access to LARP as we commodify it. On the other hand, what are the cons of commodification? I think there's a slow collapse of communality. Because a commodity is ideally focused on the self and on fulfilling personal desires, there's not that much focus on the other and what the needs of the other person are. And so in that sense, I think we're starting to lose these elements of LARP that are largely based on communal production of experiences and communal kind of building of culture. Through this, I think there's a slow kind of alienation of individuals from one another and from the context as well. And this is very common to consumer culture in general. Thirdly, through kind of the standardization of techniques, we also get replicability. So a lot of LARPs become replicable. They start to become almost kind of like a set experience that you have. And so we kind of lose a lot of the liveness of LARP. There's also a growing demand for service, which I think a lot of people that hold LARPs can attest to. So because we think LARP is on a subconscious level, we think LARP is a commodity, we demand the kind of service that we would in wider culture when it comes to consumption. So even though no one's actually getting a wage, no one's actually selling a product, we demand the service that would come with a very professional level of organization. And lastly, I think there is growing class differences because of commodification, right? Because of this focus on kind of creating bigger, better service. This means that a lot of people won't have access to it because of various cultural or economic reasons. So there's kind of growing accessibility issues, even though some needs are becoming more recognized and thus acceptable, but entering the community might become less accessible in a sense. And so when we look at these pros and cons, what actually emerges is that they're almost reflections of each other, right? So, for example, accessibility, as I just talked, it has both cons and pros. The same comes for raised standards. It allows for easier access. It allows for easier sort of handling of emotions and things like that, but it also results in this demand for service. So each of these points really is almost like a reverse of itself. And what that means is we can't have the good things without the bad things when it comes to commodification. And that also means that we cannot just reap the positive aspects of commodification like a lot of people are saying. We can't just become legitimized and then forget all the negative things that come with consumer culture. This also means that we can't just commodify some of the LARPs, because what happens when kind of this attitude of consumerism comes in, or consumer culture, if you will, it takes over everything. It takes over the whole mentality, the whole attitude, the relationship towards whatever it is that we're talking about, in this case LARP. So as LARP becomes more commodified, it means that there will be a growing culture of how we'll approach LARP, and it'll be impossible to stop all LARP from becoming commodified if we commodify some of the LARPs. A lot of people have criticized this perspective, saying, well, if we don't commodify, it means exploitation of labor, it means exploitation of other people's resources. I don't think it's a choice between commodification and exploitation, because exploitation is actually, again, the other side of consumer culture. It almost expects exploitation, and that's why it brings in these elements of seeming equality, while actually potentially exploiting what it's creating. Also, commodification will not lead to a lack of development, right? So it's not a choice between commodification and lack of development. I think we can develop in different ways. Consumer culture is just the main way that contemporary capitalist Western society develops. And that doesn't mean that every single culture needs to develop that way. Commodification is not the only way forward, and I think we need to start thinking of how, as a community, we can overcome this need to be legitimized by wider culture and thus taking on elements of consumer culture, and maybe taking things forward in a different way. So I'm going to leave you with a bunch of questions rather than answers. I think in light of growing commodification, we want to think about what kind of future do we want to carve out for LARP, and why do we want to develop in that certain direction. I think the important thing will be to question things and to understand why we want to develop in certain ways and grow. In line with this, I think it's important to think about who will have power in this future that we carve out for LARP, and who will be legitimizing us as a community. Lastly, why do we want to grow, and for what reasons, and what will it cost us as a community? Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully chat to you soon.